As I've been studying Genesis 20, the passage that we're going to be looking at this morning, I've come to see this passage as, in some ways, a companion chapter with the passage that we looked at last week in chapters 18 and 19 of Genesis. If you were with us last week, you'll remember that we were asking a question: how should we think of people who don't yet know God? After observing Abraham in the passage, we learned that people who love God shouldn't pass judgment on those who don't, leave that to God, but instead we should plead with God that they would come one day to experience his amazing grace. As I got into chapter 20 this week, I realized that the same question still holds, the broad question: how should we think of people who don't yet know God? In chapter 20, it comes to us in a different form. Last week, the question was, how should we think of people who don't yet know God whenever their sin is more evident than ours? As in the case of Abraham, as he looks on the city of Sodom. Today, the question is, how should we think of people who don't yet love God when our sin is more evident than theirs? As is the case with Abraham when he's dealing with Abimelech. By the way, I hope I don't have to spend too long persuading you that there are people who don't yet know Jesus who are living better lives than many of us who do. If you're a follower of Jesus Christ, it's very possible that you know people in your friends, your family, your colleagues in work, people who don't know Jesus, but who live a better life than you do. That patience that you wished you had, they seem to already have it in abundant supply. That integrity in the workplace that you're trying hard to develop, it seems to be theirs as if by birthright. They're not only good people, that they are doing good things. They do charity work, they recycle, they've provided more support in the neighborhood during the pandemic than you've managed to. And when you look at their lives and when we compare our lives with theirs, we can't help but think, actually, they're doing a much better job than I am. They are a better person. So this reality that there are people around us who live good lives without Jesus throws up a crucial question for us, those of us who do follow Jesus. How should we think of these people? Can we, for example, pray for them? After all, they're doing a better job of life than we are. Can we be sharing the gospel of Jesus Christ with them? Or is that impossible while they're living better lives than we are? It's a crucial question, and it's one that we're going to have before us today as we come to Genesis 20. We're going to notice three things. Abram is failing again. Abimelech's better than Abram. And like Lot in Sodom, Abimelech needs God's grace. So first, in chapter 20, we see Abram failing again. This is not Abram's finest hour. In fact, after the great success of chapter 18, this is an abject failure. In chapter 18, Abram has shown himself to be a man of faith. He's pleading to God for the salvation of the people in Sodom. Here, in chapter 20, he's fearful, he's faithless, he's weak. The Abram we meet in chapter 20 is full of excuses for his behavior and his deception. When Abimelech challenges him in verses 9 to 10, Abram tries to justify himself in a couple of ways. First, verse 11, he shares a perception that he has. There is surely no fear of God in this place, and they'll kill me because of my wife. Abram's not the last person to assume the worst of other people without taking the trouble to give them a chance. Secondly, in verse 12, he tries to get himself off the hook on a technicality. He says, talking about Sarah, she really is my sister, the daughter of my father, though not of my mother, and she became my wife. Well, Abram, that's just the point. She is your wife, and she's therefore not available for other men. Did you notice that after he's subtly tried to justify himself, that he sets about blaming God? Verse 13. And when God caused me to wander from my father's household, I said to her, to Sarah, this is all God's fault, you know. If he hadn't called me to follow him, I wouldn't be in this kind of a fix. Justifying himself, blaming God. This is not Abram's finest hour. If you've been with us throughout this Abram series, this morning's passage might feel somewhat familiar. This isn't the first time that Abram's played the she's my sister trick with Sarah in order to save his own skin. The events here, recorded here, they're reminiscent of a previous occasion, 20 or more years earlier, when Abram and Sarah had used the same deception on a trip to Egypt. We looked at that episode back in chapter 12. Actually, while there's a similarity with Abram's behavior in Egypt, what Abram's doing here is even worse than what he did back then in Egypt. At that stage, he didn't know much about what God was going to do for him and through him. By now, he's had repeated promises from God that his offspring would come through Sarah. Twice, God has promised that Sarah's going to have Abram's child within the next year. With these promises ringing in his ears, at a time when he's been told that Sarah will conceive a child, we have to wonder what on earth Abram's doing, allowing her to go into Abimelech's harem. From a human perspective, Abram's risking the entire plan that God has shared with him. It makes for frustrating reading, doesn't it? Abram doesn't seem to have learned from his mistakes. Before we're too hard on Abram, let's admit that we don't always learn from our mistakes very quickly either. We repeat our old sins. Our fear that prevented us from trusting God in the past prevents us from trusting his promises in the present. I can look back on one particular period in my life when I was particularly slow to learn to trust God and to learn from my mistakes. As a young adult, my girlfriend of the time split up with me. And I remember throwing my toys out of the pram spiritually. I blamed God. I huffed with God. For 6 months, I'm sure, I just didn't take much to do with God at all. I was miserable, and I chose to stay that way. You would think that having done that once, I would do better next time around. But no. Whenever I found myself in a similar situation a short time later, I behaved in much the same way. It took me to go through the same cycle of heartache 3 or 4 times over a period of years before I began to learn the lessons that God wanted me to learn. Eventually, it dawned on me that even though my girlfriend's love blew hot and cold, God's love was steadfast. Eventually, I learned not to run from God when I was hurt, but rather to run to him and to live in his love. Abram was slow to learn the lessons of faith. So am I. Just now we're going to pause for a moment. We're going to sing a song that I suppose it reminds us that while we're faithless, while we're slow to learn, God is steady. Jesus is our cornerstone.